good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Nanette Braun. I'm from the Department of Global Communications at the United Nations, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all today to the virtual panel discussion co-organized with our UNESCO colleagues entitled Memory at Risk: The Importance of Genocide Archives for Justice, Remembrance, Research, and Education. It is a privilege, really, to be among such a distinguished panel of speakers. Today's discussion is taking place during the Kwibuka period, the days of remembrance of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, when more than 1 million people were systematically murdered in less than 3 months. They were overwhelmingly Tutsi, but also Hutu and others who opposed the genocide. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarked, those days in 1994 remain in our collective conscience as among the most horrific in human history. Our event today is the 5th episode in the live discussion series Beyond the Long Shadow, Engaging with Difficult Histories, organized by the Department of Global Communications. Historical integrity is essential in educating about mass atrocity and genocide. Denial and distortion of past events are important tools in the arsenal of those who spread misinformation and want to rewrite or even erase history. Archives are critical to counter denial and distortion. Archives safeguard the records that establish the irrefutable facts of histories. Genocide archives in particular are essential for a number of reasons. For bringing perpetrators to justice, and we think immediately of the significance of the archives developed for the Nuremberg trials, for example. For the remembrance of victims, survivors, and their families and communities, as venues for academic research and study, and to educate current and incoming generations on the history and lessons of atrocities. The act of archiving, of keeping a record of the historical moment, can be an act of resistance. Be it in the extraordinary work done by the Onyek Shabazz archivists in the Warsaw Ghetto, holding onto a garment of a loved one murdered by the Interahamwe militia in Rwanda, or the careful work done in Cambodia's documentation center. Genocidaires aim to remove any trace of a people, not only their bodies, but their legacy, their language, their history, their religion, their music, their culture. Genocidaires engage in a battle to erase history. Archives are bulwarks against such erasure. The Department of Global Communications serves to build bridges between archives and the public to support the essential memory work they perform. For this reason, we were pleased to lend our support to the Harrelson Archives project, Every Name Counts. Today is yet another opportunity for us to show our support. We have all heard the quote, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Archives are the guardians of history, of the memories of events and lives that were lost but are not forgotten. Thank you again for joining us for this enriching discussion, and I would now like to hand over to my colleague Cecilia Barbieri from UNESCO, with whom we are organizing today's event. Thank you so very much, and looking forward to a very enriching discussion. Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nanette. Well, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are based. So allow me to join Nanette to also welcoming you in the name of UNESCO to this timely online discussion. And I would like to thank our partners at the UN Department of Global Communications mandated outreach programs on the Holocaust and on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda for co-organizing this discussion, this panel discussion. And I also would like to thank, of course, our distinguished speakers and moderator for their participation. So as we heard also from Nanette, preserving the memory and transmitting the history of genocide through research and education bring us back to UNESCO's fundamental mission to create peaceful, secure and inclusive societies through education, through culture and through science. Atrocity crimes are, we can say, uncomfortable paths to speak and to learn about. The acknowledgement of the facts, measures of justice and reparations for the victims, introduction in educational curricula and in academic research may take decades when they take place at all. So these crimes carry a legacy of victimization and guilt that does not go comfortably away with time. Most often, they are denied and contested by the very perpetrators of the crimes and by their followers, years and years later. We know that disinformation, lack of informed knowledge, and attempts to falsify history and shirk responsibility for the crimes of the past put memory at risk. And that is the reason why archives are so important. They are the gatekeepers of memory. Without archive, we know that there can be no production of evidence, no research, and no education as well. Archives bear witness to the unimaginable atrocities committed against victims and against survivors. And they are an essential resource for legal procedures and conflict transformation processes in the aftermath of genocide. Such processes take courageous voices like that of Nadia Murad, who, supported by her initiative, advocates for the victims of the Yazidi Genocide. And we are delighted to welcome the Executive Director, Abid Shamdin, as one of our speakers today. Establishing comprehensive archives in post-genocide societies can be a challenge, just like ensuring the continuous preservation of their contents and their accessibility to the public. It requires time and expertise. It requires technological support, and it requires forward thinking. So UNESCO assists and supports member states worldwide in this endeavor. Through the Memory of the War program that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, UNESCO protects documentary heritage, including significant collections such as the Oynek Chavez archives of the Warsaw Ghetto that we heard mentioned by Nanette, born out of Jewish resistance against Nazi Germany. The Yad Vashem's pages of testimony in Israel, or the emblematic diaries of Anna Frank. Some are less known, like the journal of the Nama leader Hendrik Witbooi, which is a significant testimony of the genocide against the Herero Nama perpetrated by the German colonial forces on the territory of today's Namibia. The Harrelson archives and Tuolsleng Genocide Museum archives are also part of the register, and I'm honored to welcome their directors among today's panelists. UNESCO has been working for more than 10 years to safeguard and digitize the archive of Tuolsleng and to ensure their accessibility and to preserve the memory of genocide through time and beyond the lifespan of its victims and the perpetrators. In Rwanda, only last month, UNESCO supported the establishment of a Rwanda National Memory of the War Committee to identify Rwandan documentary heritage to be included in the Memory of the World Register. As the genocide against the Tutsi recedes in time, this work has never been more important. And we are grateful to Vincent Duclerc from France and Jean Damascene Bizimana from Rwanda for joining us today. The very recent archival work done in France and Rwanda on the genocide of the Tutsi is one example of many in which archival records have contributed to a better understanding of the complex processes of past genocides, and there further a critical examination of related responsibilities at national as well as at international level. UNESCO and the UN, the United Nations, have gathered today a panel of the leading experts and researchers working for and working with some of the most significant genocide archives around the world. So we look forward to their insights and reflection, and we wish you all an engaging discussion. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to UNESCO and the Department for Global Communications at the United Nations for bringing us together for this hugely important panel. We've got, as we've just heard, a distinguished group of speakers, and over the next hour, I think we will all be left with a great sense of this universality of genocide, this unimaginable events that take place because human beings design and programs that exclude people to the point where they will be destroyed from our societies. We have speakers from throughout the world across 90 decades, beginning from the Holocaust right the way through, as we've just heard with Nadia's initiative. Abid will be talking about ongoing events or very recent events of genocide. And so I'm very grateful for our panelists. I'm very grateful for you all being here. And we've had an introduction, so we will go straight into the first speaker, Florian Azullay from the Harrelson archives. And Florian, can you first of all start by describing to those who may not have heard of this, of the Harrelson archives, when it was set up and what it was there for, and you are representing the oldest of the archives, the most established archive, but we'd like to know a little bit about how it came about. I know you've been the director there for the past 5 years.
Thank you so much, James. Actually, the Harrelson archives were not established as an archive, but as a tracing service by the Allied forces during the war, actually in London. And the idea was to collect all the information they could find about deportation and persecution of the victims of the Nazi regime, to help the families to find their loved ones or to hear about their fate. And as the armies liberated Europe and Germany, they actually confiscated all the documentation they could find. And it means today we do have actually in our archives the original documentation from many concentration camps. And the archives, it became slowly the work started really as a tracing service, and it grew into an archive as actually many inquiries came. Many families asked for information, and you have to think that actually for many years the inquiries were actually already first-hand testimonies about experiences during the war, and they became part of the archives. And of course, at the time, the tracing service acquired copies of other archives to make sure that they could actually fulfill their duty. So that's how it started and became a full-fledged archive in the following years. So now we are the world's really largest archive on the victims of National Socialism, with information on more than 17.5 million people.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility that you have, Florian. Could you give us some insight from your own experience, how the Harrelson archives contribute to benefiting victims and survivors, but also how do researchers access your archive? How is it interpreted? How does that then have impact on wider society, on remembrance and our knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust?
Mm-hmm. I would say, thank you for this question. The first beneficiaries of this archives were really the families and the relatives of the victims of National Socialist persecution. At the beginning, first there was a tracing task, and then very quickly came the issue of compensation and restitution. And the archive played, a tracing service at the time it was called, played a very important role in confirming to authorities, establishing certificates that people had been incarcerated. And this was a very important and generally a necessary document to gain compensation from the German authorities. And now I would say we are more and more moving to another aspect of our work, which is actually helping families to mend the holes in family histories. We still receive 20,000 inquiries per year. So there are still a lot of families looking for information about their loved ones. And we have a lot of visitors on our website. Our documents are online, are accessible as much as they can be. And we have almost 1 million visitors. So there's a lot of interest. Yes.
Can I just interrupt there a minute? Did you say all of your documents are digitized and online?
Almost. We are very lucky that almost 90% of our documents are digitized, means they exist as digital copies, which does not mean that they are accessible, because very often they are not indexed yet. But we have a very clear rule that was established by the International Commission that governs the Harrelson archives, that says every document that is older than 25 years can be made accessible publicly. So this is why these documents are now on our website, searchable, let's say. But to improve accessibility, which is really important, we've started a crowdsourcing initiative. It's called Every Name Counts. And here we can see that we actually combine many aspects of our work. It's the issue of access and improving the metadata so that the documents can be accessible, but also the issue of sensitizing and education, because we have now a very increasingly growing community, more than 20,000 people, and a lot of media attention to that, participating in indexing these documents, consulting educational tutorials, and actually being inspired to know more and to learn more about this episode of history. So this is how we try to combine the issue of access, which is crucial and key, with education, which becomes more and more important.
So there's been a huge challenge of denial of the Holocaust since the end of the war, since, in fact, while the Holocaust was still happening, it was being denied. And what role do archives play in combating denial? It's particularly important in an age of misinformation, and on social media in particular, that there's a lot of confusion and blurring the boundaries between truth and myth. What role have you seen that the Harrelson archives have played in addressing this problem?
I would say, first of all, one of the core missions, mandates of the Harrelson archives and of every archive is to safeguard the records. And this is really something that is really a necessary and a key task and mission. Second, what I think is really very important is actually to give access to researchers and to educators. And this is where we see our mission as a service provider, to be really at their service, to provide the data, to give access to the documents, to help them search and find their ways to documentations. And we can see more and more in some countries, archives are being instrumentalized by national authorities. So researchers don't have access anymore, or are punished for having maybe utilized archival records of the Holocaust or of World War II. So it's all the more important that documents like ours, which very often are also copies of documents that are actually from these countries, are accessible. So that's really where I see our role, to make it accessible, to make it clear to everybody that we have these records.
That's really wonderful. I'm conscious that among our other speakers, they represent projects, documentation projects for much newer archives. And what advice would you have for them, given the 75 years of experience of or longer of the Harrelson archives?
I'm not sure I can give you really a very good piece of advice, because I do think actually the real issue is not expertise, but it's resources. And for archives, and I can see it also in Germany, where we are in a, I would say, very privileged environment, where the government is funding archives that preserve the memory of the Holocaust, of the persecution by the Nazis. You really have the issue of very small initiatives who are really struggling for their lives, and actually to keep the records, to digitize them, to make them accessible. So what I can see, what sort of works here in Germany and Europe, is when these very smaller initiatives actually are linked to each other and share resources, because these digitization efforts are extremely costly, as we all know, and it is necessary to share resources. what we try to do, for example, in our area of work, is to offer to all smaller initiatives across Europe, actually the platform, to give them space in our database and our own platform to display and find their documents. This is one solution, but it doesn't, of course, work for everybody. Yes, link, share resources, and link the data. I think show that your data, the information you have, sheds light on data that others have and how important it is and necessary to link data. I think these are two actually pieces of advice I would give. But I know the big issue is actually resources.
Well, thank you, Florian. We'll move on to our next speaker, Jean Damascene Bizimana, who is Executive Secretary of the Rwandan National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide. And prior to this, he was a member of the Rwandan Senate. He was also in that position, he was the head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Rwandan Senate, and he holds a PhD in law and as various teaching and research positions. He's also been involved as the vice chairman of the Independent Commission investigating the plane crash of the former president Habyarimana in April 1994, and was also the member of the commission in charge of investigating the role of France in the genocide against the Tutsi of 1994. So Dr. Bizimana, could you first of all give us a little bit of an insight into what happens in Rwanda, particularly with your commission for the fight against genocide? How is the memory of the genocide preserved in Rwanda 27 years after the events of April 1994? I think you may need to unmute. I think you're still muted, Jean Damascene. Okay. There we go.
Very well. Thank you very much, James. The National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide has a collection of archives, mostly from the Gacaca tribunals, which functioned for about 10 years through to 2012. And the Gacaca tribunals, before becoming operative, first collected information. And what did that entail? Well, communities in each village got together and established the facts during genocide. So how events unfolded in the communities, who took part, who were the victims, and what kind of damages occurred or ensued as a result of the attacks. And so that led to a first series of documents following the collection of documents. And that meant that then perpetrators could be tried. Prosecution could take place. So the first phase was, first of all, to collect facts. Over 8,000 tribunals thus were able to function. Then a second series of documents. These were formed by testimonies heard during the trials, testimonies from victims, but also by perpetrators and accomplices of the genocide. So the Gacaca tribunals were an opportunity to advocate or to admit to crimes. So you have genocidaires who described the occurrences, the facts exactly as they committed them. That led to collecting a lot of details. The third part were the rulings. A lot of people did not know that they had, in fact, or did not admit to taking part in the genocide, and there were testimonials explaining that they had taken part in genocide. So 60,000 pages of witness statements and other information and facts were collected as part of the prosecution. We also have audiovisual tapes, about 8,000 tapes. So these are large-scale trials, in particular those against the perpetrators and those that planned the genocide. They were heard, they then testified in court, and all of that was videotaped and traced. Then there are also other pieces of evidence that we try and collect from various administrative institutions that operated in 1994. So I'm talking about ministries, districts, municipalities, prefectures, and their administrative departments. So we're now collecting all possible documents, bringing them to the National Committee in order to establish a very large collection or body of work. And another category, we are working with the Supreme Court and the Ministry of Justice to ensure that the genocide trials that have taken place in the ordinary courts can also be the object of information collection so that we can centralize all of that. So those are the archives that we have until now. Now, we have also inherited the archives used by the National Committee that had been set up in 2006 to look into France's role into the genocide. And we have received that as a legacy, if you like. So those are the four types of archives that we have for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that overview, Dr. Bisimana. Can you give a little bit of an insight to us about how the archives in Rwanda have practically contributed to justice, whether this is justice in the through the courts, the legal courts, or through the homegrown solutions, or transitional justice in its broader sense? What role does the documentation archives play and continue to play 27 years on?
Thank you. There's an excellent question. The archives held by the Commission are widely used in the legal process. In Rwanda, you still have a number of ongoing trials, such as for those people who'd been extradited. And so once they are extradited and arrive in Rwanda, they are entitled to a free and fair trial. And so the Gacaca tribunals, or rather the documents therefrom, are used by the judges, by the lawyers on both sides. And so those archives are precious because they allow legal proceedings to take place unhindered. Also, you have a number of witnesses and or victims that have died. They did provide their testimony during the Gacaca trials. Well, those archives can be used by the courts even after the death of those persons. Also, you have people involved in the Tutsi massacre in Rwanda, but who took refuge in other countries, Belgium, France, Canada, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, or elsewhere. And courts in those countries have prosecuted or are prosecuting those Rwandan citizens, and they can come and get evidence either for or against those people in order to establish the criminal responsibility of those people who now live abroad. And most of the planners of the genocide were intellectuals, were civilians. They were also military personnel, and 99% of them have fled abroad. So they are being prosecuted in another context. Research is being undertaken from abroad. And so the CNLG archives are an excellent tool in providing information about the facts that these people are liable for. Then you also have the International Tribunal for Rwanda, International Permanent Tribunal for Rwanda, that needs to investigate a number of people arrested. Cécile Kamunga, when she came to France last year, was arrested. And the archives of the Gacaca tribunals really played an important role. So, in brief, the CNLG archives are a very, very important collection of information, very important for the entire legal process. They help in establishing the criminal responsibility of individuals and also allow the accused to find information that may exonerate them if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, last month, the president of the French Republic visited Rwanda, and my colleagues were honored to help host President Emmanuel Macron as he visited the Kigali Genocide Memorial. And he made a landmark historic statement during his visit. And he had accepted a 1,000-word, 1,000-page report even, which was the result of a 2-year investigation of a commission that was led by Vincent Duclerc, who is our next speaker. And it's a very great privilege for us to have you with us, Vincent. Can you, first of all, give us a little bit of an insight into the work that you've undertaken the past 2 years? Because this remarkable report that you produced, how possible would it have been had it not been for governments and individuals and institutions over the past 27 years documenting testimony and preserving documents and memory? How much did you rely on archives for your research?
Merci James. Effectivement, le rapport.
Thank you very much. Well, indeed, the report established a number of conclusions. As a quick summary, that there was a very grave responsibility on the part of French authorities in the process that led to the genocide of the Tutsis. There's interference. There's interference with the speaker's microphone, and the interpreters cannot distinguish what he's saying. Could someone perhaps please ask him to resolve the sound issue, please? Too many interferences, inaudible for the interpreter.
Vincent, the interpreter has said that they can't hear you too clearly. There seems to be some interference. I don't know whether it's your microphone at your side.
Maybe I will leave the...
The issue is not the language, sir. It is the microphone. In French, please. In French, please. So, responsibilities. Everything's fine. Thank you. France's responsibilities were identified in our report. Perhaps this is a paradox that we should underscore. The report was commissioned by the top most political position in the country, France's President Emmanuel Macron. But we established this responsibility, and this thus allowed more independent work by our commission. So our commission was independent, 13 members. Although it was a political initiative, in the end, our commission was able to work freely in preparing this 1,200-page report. It was immediately made public as soon as it was handed over. It was not revised, reviewed, otherwise examined before being handed over, immediately made public. It is in the process of being translated in English. The conclusions, the findings have already been translated, therefore allowing many people around the world to become aware of the main findings of the report. So the report is very important. The President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, and his advisors noticed that there was a very big impasse in reflecting upon the role of France in the Tutsi genocide. So an impasse, a lot of friction between researchers, members of NGOs, former witnesses, a lot of tension, and a very complicated relationship with Rwanda, almost a Cold War, a legal battle almost between both countries. And one way of coming out of that impasse was to achieve some kind of objective observation or gather additional knowledge, hence the role of French archives. The role of the archives was threefold: exiting the impasse. There was a cloud of suspicion that hung over France because France's archival material was confidential, was top secret. So opening up the archives showed goodwill and a desire to break the logjam. Also, state archives document actions and decisions, thus establishing truths that are less disputable than witness statements. We know that they are deemed very reliable in trials, for example. Also, third, it was a show of willingness to open up the archives. Also, the report I mentioned, which is available to one and all and is to be translated into English, is accompanied by a certain number of important elements. First of all, there is a description of methodology, 140 pages, explaining the methodology, which explains how the members of the commission, or in what state they've found the French archives. Also, there is a complete inventory of French archives on Rwanda, the Tutsi genocide, and the relationships between France and Rwanda. And thirdly, the opening up, declassifying of archives with several thousand documents, thus showing an even bigger opening up of French archives on the topic.
It's a great example of how research and archives not only can impact on society and communities in a positive way, but it must have given you a great deal of satisfaction to see that the result of your work had an influence and impact on international relations between, as you described, sometimes the quite a tense relationship between Rwanda and France over many, many years. You've established some sense of common understanding, and that's quite a remarkable result of work that's come out of archives. And just to come back to the original question, your work and your research, how possible would it have been if there hadn't been over many years different governments and individuals sort of preserving that memory? Did you rely on existing archives, or were you having to find new testimony sometimes?
Alors, je voudrais quand même dire par rapport à la première partie de votre intervention.
Concerning the first part of your comment and question, of course, researchers were very proud when the report was submitted on May 27th. We're very glad to see the warming of relations between President Macron and President Kagame, thus ending an extremely concerning situation, concerning for Rwanda as well. France was seen as hostile against Rwanda because Rwanda wanted to hold France to account concerning its role in the genocide. So I would say that that helped with overall justice being rendered. But that wasn't the original aim of the report of the researchers. Researchers work towards truth, scientific truth. So certainly is not to be construed as a politically motivated action. And I really want to underscore that. And that's why I'm very happy to speak here at UNESCO. You know, research needs to continue. And indeed, the Rwandan government did also commission a very important report, the Muse report. It holds the same conclusions. There's also the Musso report that establishes a number of truths.
It's critical to underscore that the research is still underway. Now, what has changed through the work of our commission is this political commitment to opening the archives. Not all of the institutions, the Assemblée nationale, which had conducted its own information mission at parliamentary level that many questions have been asked of. That mission reviewed archives, but concluded that France had not been involved in the genocide. So that raises questions. But so not all institutions followed the presidential call. So what researchers do well is to explore all available archives to understand the role of a state and political will. And in that regard, the political support that provided access to the archives was very beneficial and allowed us, at a time when the archives that we saw were archives that indicate a number of disappearances, this advisor, that person may be absent from the archives. The archives don't indicate the overwhelming responsibility. But looking in details, we were able to see how there were warning signs that were deliberately ignored, that the overriding analysis was contrary to the facts. And only researchers are able to make these determinations. And by comparing archives, by tracking the decision-making process, by following it, we're able to arrive at our conclusions. But that requires comprehensive work. We worked for 2 years on the archives. We explored every section of the archives, unearthed everything that we were able to identify of importance, and then took up certain documents to prove the facts. And once you have gotten hold of a fact, you want to consolidate that fact with as much documentary evidence as possible. And research will go on. This research will go on. Our report our study is just the beginning. It's a starting point, and more work will be done on the testimonials. There are researchers in Rwanda working on these. Aegis Trust is also doing work to bring out testimony, which will serve to bolster our analyses.
Well, thank you so much. The work that you've published last month has made a profound contribution to our understanding, our knowledge, and also to the concerns I know that many survivors have. This assault on the facts of the genocide, and you've demonstrated so clearly how important it is to have the archives and have the research so that we can develop a consensus about the truth of what happened. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Hang Nisei, who is the director of the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Cambodia, who joined the museum in 2009, and initially as an administrative officer and as a tour guide. And you're now the head of the museum there. So Hang Nisei, it's a real pleasure for us to hear from you. And could you maybe start by first of all describing a little about the Genocide Museum, but also, you know, from your personal perspective, how you came involved and what it means to you to work at the museum.
Thank you, James Smith, for allowing me to have this, and thank you to all organizers, UNESCO, United Nations Outreach Program, and all organizers who can make this event happen. Yes, Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum was actually opened on the ground of the former Gram site S21, which was happening between 75 and 79. And among these periods of time, there were around at least 20,000 people or victims were detained, tortured, interrogated, and finally executed. So it is believed that none of these people, almost none of these people, could have survived from the site. So that was the reason why we now have plenty of documents of biographies, confession, profiles, photos, and negative, and so on in the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum archive. Just to me personally, I feel very, let's say, proud to be part of the museum. Though I was firstly joined as an administrative, and then to be part of an education and exhibition. Because working in a place like this, I could have the opportunity to learn about the Cambodian past, and also to share this knowledge to the younger generation like me, who had never experienced any of this. So, and also to another point, that being the director, I'm involved in the means of collecting care of all collection in the museum, especially working in the care of archives. And as you all understand, that the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum archive have been registered to Memory of the World in 2009 by UNESCO. And from that point of view, the archive have been taken into attention. I means that before, because of the resources of the museum we had a number of staff. We don't have any expertise who work on the archive care. But after being registered, we have internationally attention, And up until 2014 and 15, if I'm not wrong, we start to have a communication between UNESCO in Phnom Penh, who organize, who help us to find partners. And thanks to KOICA, a Korean International Cooperation Agency in Cambodia, who finance us a project called digitization, conservation and digitization of Tutsi archive since 2018, and the project finished in 2021. Actually, it would be earlier, but because of the COVID situation, it made us postpone a bit longer. So I could say that most of the documents happening in between 75 and 79 were digitized, and some of it are already online for public access, and especially photograph, biography, and not really confession. And some of the photographs are not displayed on the website because we respect to the dignities of the victims. Because some of photos, you may find some in the tourist line on display in 70, 80. We have a photo of the victim who died, but in the website, they cannot. So come back to the question, I feel very proud to be part and as a younger crew to take care of this very important, the most valuable archives in Cambodian history, recent history. I mean. Sorry, Smith, I cannot hear you.
Han, can you describe how the archives are used currently in Cambodia, either for justice for victims and survivors of genocide, or how the archive, the research around the archives influences education at the museum?
Yeah, thank you again. First, I'd like to refer back to the question how archives play in the delivering justice or finding justice for victims and survivors. Yes, for Tutsi archives, it been used by it's since 79. I mean, we have another one trial in 79. It's called Revolutionary Tribunal, and some of documents from Tutsi have been used. And recently, we also taking part or support the tribunal ETPC, extraordinary chambers in the coast of Cambodia to find justice for the victims. I mean, this in physically that everyone can see that the perpetrator were brought to justice, and the documents or archives from Tutsi Genocide Museum were the evidence to prove or to make the perpetrator acknowledge or acknowledge what they had done, especially the case of Mr. Deutsch, who was the former director of S21. He acknowledged that. And to the victims, I would say they could get both mentally and physically, because as you know, the perpetrator in the trial, he seemed not really first to recognize the victims, the victim who lost their life, and without that documents, without those archival proof, so the victim would not be acknowledged as the victims of the crime of the genocide. So first, it's have the victim to be recognized as a real victims. Second, for the survivors, I would like to raise one case happening in the trial against the Khmerus in 2018, or yeah, let's say ETPC. The case of one of the child who survived from the prison, Mr. Nong Chan Paul. He was present at the trial, and he's telling the trial that he's a survivor, but the chief of the accused person did not recognize him as a survivor. So from these documents, from the archives, DCCAM also did research on that, and proving from the documents we have, from Tutsi. So finally, the accused recognize him. So this is it's help. At least they were recognized as a real victims. So they got I mean, support or to be known as the survivors, a real survivor to prove. And also, as we all mentioned about the memory, so this archive so would be the key tools for us to remember the victims who lost their life in the regime. So again, this would bring people justice, not only uh, what we can see that to bring a perpetrator to trial, but it's also mentally or help to heal their feeling that they really be recognized by the community around them. They would be recognized by their younger generation that that crime was happening, and they would be in the means of respect of having sympathy from the people around or in the community or in internationally. For that question, second question, how for the archives? Yes, it's I would say from my own notice, from my experience, because I haven't read or haven't done any research how it influenced how many percentage of the Cambodian start to come influenced by the archive, but I can see that many young Cambodian who involved with the program organized by the museum is really understand the value of the documents of the archives, and they start using the archive to make their own research, their own small research. Let me give you like a small case. A Cambodian high school student, they can be able to go to archives, they read the archive, and they write a poetry about a victims, about a children for others. So this just only a secondary high school student who took part in our program, and they can create something for their classmates, for their friends. So that's one point I can see. The second point, what I can see is that they became influence of like the researcher. They come to the museum, they start to do research on many different topics. And one of the writer, they write about a victims whose name Bopana, and now it's named as Bopana Audio Visual Center of a very famous institution too. So she came to read the archives, and she wrote one story about Bopana. Uh, that's how I can say that it's influenced the way Cambodians start to do more research, read more about the archives. And for the museum ourselves, we use this archive for um, an educational purpose, like just to show the school children about what the archive is and how important. And we also now try to engage, especially year 2 or year 3 university student, to be aware of what is important, how important of the archives conservation would be, and the archive preservation would be, by arranging them to be an internship or joining with us to understand the process. And this is because after we got a program with a project with UNESCO, our staff have been trained on that skill of preservation, so we are able to share this knowledge to young generation. But unfortunately, the COVID situation had stopped us from implement these activities.
Yeah.
But we still have in our head that we will do it right after the situation is getting better. So thank you to that question.
And thank you for your comprehensive answer. We will have to go to our final.
I'm sorry again, I cannot hear you, James. Sorry, no. Can you hear James? I cannot hear James.
Yeah, I really appreciate you joining us this evening in Cambodia. We know it's late there. We have to move to the.
I cannot hear you,
next.
James. Sorry.
Okay, here's a problem then. Can anyone hear me? Can anyone raise a hand if you can hear me?
Dr. James, I can hear you. Shafiq here.
Yeah, we can hear you, James.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. So, Hank, thank you so much. We're going to move on to our final panelist. Then it's Abid Shamdeen. Thank you for joining us. Abid is a global development expert, and he's one of the co-founders of Nadia's initiative. Many of you will have heard about Nadia Murad, a survivor of the Yazidi genocide, who do wonderful advocacy. Certainly here in London, in the UK Parliament, have had a great impact through your sharing.
Sorry,
of,
I cannot really hear what you are saying.
Yeah. Abid, could you please tell us a little bit? We don't have long before the end of this end of this session.
But I'm sorry, I really cannot hear James what he's saying. Can I go on to what?
I'm not sure if anyone can send a message to.
Maybe the
I'll just
can some of us help me to understand what James is telling?
Yeah, Abid, if you're able to start, I'm just going to ping a message to Hang to let him know that we've just moved on.
I think he's muted now. I think he's muted now.
Great.
What would you like me to just start with? Sorry. Thank you. So maybe I'll just James, I will just start about to chat about the work Nadia's initiative and Nadia's doing.
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, it's great to be with everyone and to hear a group of experts about this very important topic, and I'm honored to join everyone, and thank you, James, for moderating. So in the context of what we heard from everyone, the Yazidi genocide and what's happening with the Yazidi genocide in Iraq is a bit different because it's an ongoing suffering for the Yazidi community. Unfortunately, the genocide started in 2014, but in our view, it has not ended. It's ongoing because of the fact that the community is still displaced. There are more than 86 mass graves that have been discovered, most of which have not been exhumed and properly documented. More than 2,800 Yazidi women and children still missing in captivity. So the documentation and the process of testimonies and memorialization of this conflict is a bit different. When Nadia started her international campaign, joining her visiting the Holocaust Memorial Museum for the first time, it gave us an idea about why it's important to document this. The global campaign that Nadia started was obviously focused on justice. Justice in a sense that from a legal perspective, bring in perpetrators of ISIS that committed crimes against Yazidis and other communities to justice in a court of law. And on that front, the global campaign Nadia started with, Amal Clooney and other individuals that supported that campaign with the government of UK, France, and the US to push the United Nations Security Council to pass resolution, I believe it's 2379, to create an investigative team, UNITAD, to collect and document evidence of ISIS's crimes against the Yazidi community. But then it was expanded, fortunately, to include the mandate includes all of Iraq, which obviously it's a big crime scene and it's a long process. UNITAD has collected after its mandate has started collecting evidence of mass graves, especially in Sinjar and Nadia's village in Kocho, exhuming these mass graves and collecting the evidence, forensic evidence, and digitizing. To come back to the topic we're specifically talking about, digitizing and documenting thousands and thousands of documents of ISIS that can be used as evidence in a court of law, but also to be archived as historic evidence against what ISIS did to Yazidis and others, recording testimonies of survivors of sexual violence and survivors of the Yazidi genocide. All of this process, since the campaign and we at Nadia's initiative started and Nadia started, is to make sure that what ISIS did will not be forgotten. As some of you might know, that Yazidis, this is not the first genocide against Yazidis. They faced other campaigns of persecution, beginning with the Ottoman Empire and beyond that. But unfortunately, most of those campaigns against Yazidis were not properly documented. As a Yazidi, for me, all I knew was oral, passing from one generation to another, that Yazidis were persecuted. Campaigns of genocide against Yazidis took place in certain decades ago, but were not properly documented. So what we wanted to do is something different with this, to make sure that one is there is legal evidence collected and documented, testimonies collected of survivors of sexual violence and genocide, and there is recognition. Like James mentioned earlier, at the UK Parliament, just recently at the Belgian Parliament, Nadia testified in Canada and other places where this campaign led to recognition by many governments that what ISIS did against Yazidis was in fact genocide. So from a legal perspective, and just recognition in general, to make sure that recognition is a obviously big step in the process of healing and recovery for survivors of genocide. Each government that does recognize this genocide is a step forward for the community and for this process that we are trying to do. Being an ongoing process, and the community being displaced, obviously for us, it's not easy to focus just on documenting the genocide, archives and justice. There are immediate needs, of course, of the community in terms of the destruction of the homeland, basic services, infrastructure, in terms of education, health, and access to just very basic services in the homeland in Sinjar. So we had to prioritize rebuilding and trying to get services back and running in Sinjar, so that those that return to Sinjar and want to return can return, and so that they can recover. And also, I think it was Florian didn't mention, also making sure that we do not re-traumatize survivors of genocide and sexual violence. We had to give them some time to heal and recover, and some space in between that process. So we obviously know it takes time, but as you mentioned, James, earlier, that in the case of Holocaust, especially, there is still denial, even though it was extensively documented. There is extensive evidence. So in the case of Yazidis, there was in real time, there was evidence in real time as it was happening. ISIS was communicating about what they were doing to Yazidis, obviously in the age of technology. And there is public evidence, but also there is a need for to make sure that it's documented properly. So what we are now in the process of doing is also memorization of sites where in the Nadia's village in Kojo and other sites in Sinjar where mass graves were discovered, to document and create memorials in these sites. This work is in partnership with IOM and the U.S. government, USAID. And as Azullay mentioned earlier, one of the main challenges we face as the Yazidi community and the Nadia's initiative has always been, especially on this front, resources, access to resources. to not have adequate resources to focus on memorialization, creating sites of this mass graves. So again, as I mentioned, we had to focus on the immediate needs for a while until then gradually move into the process of archives and recording testimonies. And now we're in the process of also creating a cemetery and memorial, a joint cemetery and memorial for survivors of this genocide in Sinjar. So there is that physical, but also the recognition and part of it globally with governments and with the United Nations and the advocacy we do. James, I know we were a bit out of time, so I don't want to go on for too long. Please ask me any questions you may have.
Yeah, Abid, we are out of time. I'd hope that we would take, there have been lots and lots of questions that we will probably, I'm afraid we're going to have to close the panel. Perhaps so if you could maybe just 1 minute. You've done very well in explaining Abid the challenges that you have in documenting during a, as you said, an ongoing genocide. But could you perhaps just maybe in 20 seconds convey what partners around the world and what the international community could and should be doing to help you, particularly with this task of documentation and in relation to remembrance and justice? What is the greatest need of the Yazidi community?
Thank you. That's a great question. The evidence that UNITAD has collected and is available obviously is a great step forward, but we need formal courts. The international community needs to establish or refer this evidence to ICC or international tribunals to act on this evidence. This evidence is no good if it's not used in a court of law. That's one step. Two, just from that presentation recently at the United Nations Security Council, when the UNITAD presented this evidence and acknowledged that this was in fact a genocide based on the evidence they have collected, what I noticed is that the representative of the Iraqi government referred to what happened to Yazidis as abuses. And I've been in multiple settings where what happened to Yazidis is not properly acknowledged, in these settings, but also in courts in Iraq. Right now, ISIS members are being prosecuted based on vague general terrorism charges. The genocide is not mentioned. There are no specific genocide trials or the fact that a widespread sexual violence campaign was conducted against the Yazidi women, especially. These trials are not being conducted in Iraq, and that's why the Yazidi community trusts an international body to oversee and prosecute ISIS members and to use this evidence collected by UNITAD.
Thank you, Abid. We're going to have to end now because this panel has been, I guess, initiated in response to the landmark report of our panelist Vincent Duclair, and we're here partly to mark the Kwibuka 27, the remembrance of the genocide against the Tutsi. I just want to end with, if I may, just with one remark from our colleagues in Rwanda. Jean Damascene, could you, one question to you, and this is to get a sense of the response of survivors in Rwanda to the report when President Macron sort of accepted the findings and the responsibility. This was a result of research in archives having an impact not only on international relations, but I think many would want to know, how did this impact on survivors? What was their response? What was the significance of this report?
Well, survivors of the genocide are mainly have to deal with the issue of the denial, negationism of the genocide against the Tutsis. But the information gathered in the records of the Gacaca trials and other documents make it possible to establish incontrovertible proof of the responsibility of a certain number of people in this genocide. We also work with the Education Board, with the Ministry of Education as well, and these these archives contribute material for school books, for secondary school pupils and university pupils. The material also allows researchers in different institutions, both national and international. We have a partnership with a number of universities in the US and beyond, and France, who send students over here to conduct research in the archives. So the archives are a very good tool. Victims also often need those records from the Gacaca trials for their work. The material is also very useful for those who want to write the story of their families. 70% of our population is under the age of 30. So that means that most of them were not born yet at the time of the genocide. Others were infants. And so they need to be able to find information about what happened to their family, whether they were victims themselves or relatives of victims or relatives of the perpetrators. We do have descendants of perpetrators who come to get information from the archives to find out more and be able to reconstruct their lives. They need to understand what happened, what was the responsibility of their parents and members of their family, and what to do with that information. Victims too also need reparation. Reparation is provided for by law when the perpetrators of the damage has been identified. So the children or descendants can find information here and can start a trial to get reparation. So it's all very important. And James, as you know, we started digitizing our archives as well. We are presently in the phase of indexation, and in the near future, all that material will be accessible following prior authorization, of course, but without having to travel to Rwanda. So you see that for victims, the material is really essential. It's also very essential for memorialization, but also important for Rwandan society as a whole. Society needs to know the true story of the genocide against the Tutsi, and the Gacaca records are really extremely important in that respect. May I add something, James? I'd like to add one specific point.
Very briefly, Vincent, very briefly. Yeah, thank you.
You focused on the closer diplomatic ties now between France and Rwanda, thanks to the work undertaken as part of our reports. Well, there needs to be more than a diplomatic rapprochement. There also needs to be that same rapprochement between scientists, researchers. Tomorrow, I will be going with members of my commission to Rwanda, and I'll be meeting with Dr. Bizimana in a few days to work on new scientific and archival endeavors. And so I'm saying à bientôt to Jean Damascene. Thank you.
That is great note to end on, a message that is completely in the spirit of UNESCO about cooperation between organizations, institutions, and countries in our efforts to contribute to the building of peace between people. So with that, I want to thank all our panelists, from Florian, Jean Damascene, Vincent, Hang, and Abid, and particularly a wonderful, huge thanks to UNESCO and to the UN Global Communications. We're very grateful that you have brought us together to have a conversation which we must continue in the future. Sadly, we have to draw it to an end now, but I hope we will all continue to interact. I'm so sorry we've not had chance to take all the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A, but let's all stay in touch. It's been a very interesting and deep discussion that I hope everyone has found great benefit from. So we will continue. There is no closure on these discussions, and I look forward to speaking and hearing from many of you as the days and weeks go by. Thank you.